Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us in this conversation. I hope it really will be a conversation this evening. Maybe just as background and context for how we are coming to this conversation, the Desmond and Leah Tutu Legacy Foundation's core focus of our work is what we call deepening societal healing. And we think about healing as comprising of three major processes. The processes of reconciliation, which is really, to us, how do we try to find each other across divides? The processes of reparation and repair. How do we tackle injustice? How do we make right what is unjust? And then the theme for this evening is really how do we reimagine who we can be, how our societies can be, how can we bring imagination into the process of healing. And imagination is an incredibly powerful tool. It really gives us the opportunity to create a vision of a future that we'd like to see. Something, maybe I'm not alone in feeling that at the moment there's sort of an atmosphere of more like despair and cynicism about the future of South Africa. And really we have to find hope, and we have to find our way towards that hope through creating really positive visions of who we can be together and how we can operate as a society. The Arch used imagination in really interesting ways, and one of the most famous, which everyone is now cynical about, is coining the phrase the Rainbow Nation, which when we look back on the history can seem like a very naive idea. But at the time of leading a march of 30,000 people down Adderley Street, of all faiths, of different races, at the height of apartheid, to stand there and to a crowd that was diverse racially, diverse by religion, to say we are the rainbow people and we can be a new nation. It's a radical proposition, and I think we do a disservice to quite how radical it was to imagine a future where we could be together at that point in time, particularly with the violence of that time. So our sense is really that we need to build a sustained and common and collective vision for South Africa and for how we are with each other. One that doesn't just rely on us winning World Cups, although hopefully we will do so on Saturday and we will feel the collective euphoria of feeling like one nation for a moment. There's many, many fault lines of identity in our society. Race is the obvious one, but gender, sexual orientation, faith, ethnicity, nationality, disability, there's a whole range of identities along which we experience division and we experience disconnection. In his wonderful book, Nation on the Couch, Professor Wabi Long describes South Africa as being characterized by alienation, which he describes as a relationship of relationlessness, that we are in relationship with each other, but in a relationship of relationlessness. And so what we're trying to do this evening and in the series of conversations that will come is to try and shed light, to try and collectively develop the beginnings of a conversation that moves us towards a reimagining of the terms of recognition between people in South Africa. It's very delicate work, and what I hope this evening is that we'll all engage in a delicate conversation about really exploring these various dimensions of our society. I'm joined this evening by three incredible panelists, and we've spoken beforehand about everyone being here both because they have professional expertise and they're very wise people, but they're also just human beings. And we're all here in our human fragility as much as we are with all of the expertise we might bring. So our panelists, just to run through them quickly, we've got Zinzi Mgolodela, who is the Director of Corporate Affairs for Woolworths. She is someone who embodies and lives social justice wherever she is, even inside a big corporate, and plays that out through, for instance, chairing the Restitution Foundation, which I hope we'll hear a little bit about later this evening. Dr. Buhle Zuma is a social psychologist. He's the founder of Alaji Consulting, I hope I pronounced it correctly. And his career in teaching and research has primarily used multidisciplinary approaches to questions around anti-Black racism, around the post-apartheid condition, around the unfinished business, and about freedom, violence, and imagination. Then our final panelist is Luando Klaso, a constitutional lawyer by background, but a writer and facilitator. She founded the organization Including Society as a vehicle for engaging in the strengthening of democracy and the unfinished business of our stories and histories as South Africans. So let's give them all a round of applause just to start, to settle the nerves. So we're going to try and have as much of a conversation as possible between us and then open into the broader audience for a conversation. But I'd love to start just by hearing from each of you your human story of what brings you to this kind of work. And maybe, Luando, we can start with you.
What brings me here in this moment in my life is I came of age in the 1990s, and that was a singularly unique moment, that I couldn't appreciate because of how young I was, but it was big event after big event, like Mandela's out of prison, Chris Hani is assassinated, and elections, first black president, and all these things that also affect your personal life of now, you're going to a white school, live in the black township, and all these changes. And I think what I realized at the time that in the midst of the hurly-burly of the 90s is that there was a lot of creativity. There was a sense of something being birthed. And as young as I was, I could perceive that. I was like, something is emerging here. And there were people in my life who were involved in helping that emerge. And a lot of them were lawyers. And I knew that I wanted that to be my tool for the purposes of contributing to a place that I can see is so beloved. Like the extent that people went to fight for a country is something that I still marvel at, because at some point you think people would just, walk away and forget about it and not love a country the way that I saw a country being loved. So I think that's the question of what does it mean to love a country, because I think I do. And I think that in loving a country, I want to be part of the building, to be an architect as well. And I thought law was the tool for that. And I did work as a lawyer, but I realized that it's a tool, but it may not be the only one or the best one. And I realized that, in expressing my love for a country, it doesn't only have to, the pathway to that. I have multiple pathways to it. So that's what brings me to this work, the idea of nation building, the idea that from a fragmented past, we could build something. And I think, just quickly to say that when I was in primary school, the Constitution was being negotiated, and that also played out in school, right? We would have workshops about this thing that's being drafted. We got the pocket Constitution and all of that. And I remember feeling so empowered, like I have rights, and I went home the one time and my dad was like, "Can you get me a glass of water from the kitchen, please?" I was like, "No, because I have rights." And it kind of like, so I was living that tension of, trying to understand human rights, what it means for someone's own sense of place in the world, their dignity and empowerment and all of that, but also navigating being in relationship at home with my parents. And when I got older and I really realized the import of the Constitution is that the 1993 Constitution has a post-amble. And that post-amble, to the last page, it says that it means to be a bridge. It says this Constitution is a bridge. So I find that what brings me to this work, if I had to give you a symbol for it, is that bridge. And I realize that I'm a part of a people. Ta-Nehisi Coates has this saying that I love, that they made us into a race, but we made ourselves into a people. And I feel like what apartheid did was reduce us to a race, and we're doing the work of making ourselves into a people. And when you look at the Constitution, and it starts with the words, "we the people," and me considering "we" to be the most important word, and trying to find meaning to that we is what brings me to this work. And also, when you think of the bridge, the post-amble says we're trying to go from the starting point. I think as South Africans, we know the starting point. The starting point is inequality, injustice, oppression, and trauma, and we're trying to move forward to something. And I think each of us are tasked with moving across this bridge. And I often say to people, reflect where you are on this bridge, right? We always look at transformation as something someone else needs to do, but it's something you need to do. You need to move across this bridge. And I think there's a lot of work beyond the law that also implicates changing hearts and not just changing the regime or changing laws, but changing ourselves. So that's why I became a lawyer, but I don't practice anymore. We'll get that. We'll get to that.
Thank you. That's such a powerful way of putting it. And I'm so struck by being a beloved nation. I think it's Brene Brown, but I could be wrong, who said, "Who is it that loved you into being?" And what a beautiful way of thinking about who loved our nation into being.
I also want to put in Vincent Harding. He's someone, he passed away, but I love him so much. He talks about how a nation goes from being wretched into being a beloved nation. And that's the journey I'm interested in.
Wow, thank you. Bukhle, over to you. What is it that brings you to this kind of work?
Thank you. Is it on? Yeah?
I think so.
Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you for having me here, Janet, and thank you to all of you for being here. I guess two things briefly bring me here today. The first is my scholarly interest in thinking and puzzling over what is post-apartheid South Africa. So I've done a bit of thinking around that as a social psychologist. I've done a bit of writing around that too. So it's a question that continues to interest me. In particular, thinking about the idea of the Rainbow Nation, and how do we become that? How do we kind of embody and live that? And then puzzling around what have been the obstacles to that realization of that imagination of South Africa as a Rainbow Nation. So that's partly the scholarly work. But also added to that more recently is, I would say, what brings me here is spirit, quite frankly. So I've moved from scholarly work to some degree and now do a lot of my work, what I would call spiritual counseling in many ways. So I work with, not in many ways, essentially that's what it is. So I somehow stumbled, long story, took some time, realized that I have a very powerful gift to channel messages from spirit and other non-physical beings. So at the surface of it, I appear as a coach, but what I do is just that I literally just channel messages. So that gives me an opportunity to work with individuals, with couples, whether they be married or not. I sometimes work with entire families. And the core of that work is around relationships. And the most fundamental part of relationships that I focus on is with the relationship with self, or relationship with higher self, as the foundation of everything that we do. Thank you.
Thanks, Bukhle. So powerful to bring all of the aspects of ourselves to the table, including our spiritual selves. Thank you. Sinzi, what is it that brings you to this work?
Oh, wow. Good evening, everyone. Really honored to be in this space. What brings me to this work? I think in reflecting about that question, I feel like it's called me. I didn't get to it. It has called me. One looks at career, one looks at, personal life, and you realize, that this is a calling. And I think when we get called, the most important thing is, do we embrace? And then what happens? So it's been really wonderful for me to embrace this calling. I suppose I grew up in a rural area, proudly so. That gave me perspective. Ended up in a Bush university, and that crafted my thinking at a very interesting time in our country. Same, I think, Luando, to your reflection. And I really, when I look back to that time at that university, I know I was being made. You know, yeah, I'm excited about being a brand person. I was excited about brands and marketing. And here I find myself landing my first job and being fascinated about employment equity in a business. So it fast track, it became very clear very quickly that I had a role in corporate that is not traditional corporate work, you know. To give you a taste, I've done things like community development in corporate. You know, when you find yourself, you're quite old. You know, everybody's talking about sales and, you know, margins and profit. And you are a cost center because all you're concerned about is the heartbeat of this organization, is the spiritual being of the organization. And then I was asked at some point by one corporate to start a BEE office. You know, this is like a response to compliance, you know. And I refused to be driving compliance of something that sounded and looked like a tool for social justice. Needless to say that I've managed to get the narrative right in that corporate to you know, a social justice conversation. BE is just a tool. Employment equity is just a tool. We've forgotten that. We have a legacy that requires that we have all these tools, but at the heart of it, the intent is social justice. So right now, I see myself as a social justice practitioner in a business. And I have reflected about, do I belong in a business? I've had my, you know, a little bit of an experience in NGO space, not full time, but, you know, in boards and all of that. But I think my calling is to change those spaces. And it's amazing for me how much impact, you know, one can have with the kind of resources that you find in corporate, but it's not easy. Definitely not easy, but that's my calling, and it calls for a different kind of leadership, spiritual leadership, you know, something that again is not a traditional topic, you know, in a corporate and in a business environment, but something that is uniquely South African and maybe, you know, some parts of the world. But what I think about the potential of that in the South African context, I have hope.
Thank you, Zinzi. It's so interesting. I mean, the calling feels very resonant across all of you. The calling to be in this interesting place of trying to craft something new out of the trauma and the legacy that we've been left. I'd love to just, I'm going to throw out a question to all of you. You know, one of the challenges around identity and belonging is that our individual stories and individual identities come up against the structures of society, and so often there's a difficulty in that experience. And so I was sort of wondering, how do we navigate that? How do we navigate figuring out how to work from the individual into the structural, and what is it that we can do as individuals in trying to reshape these things around us?
You know, the interesting word there is navigate, and for me that word like connotes like trying to, you know, navigate like a landmine. And I think we're so sensitive in how we you know, don't want to offend. And I think that's why we probably all will use the word navigate, because it feels very, as you said in the beginning, it's so delicate, everything feels highly charged. And I think that some of the metaphors that I've been, you know, gravitating towards lately is more like, how do we dance, you know? And I have a friend who loves the jazz metaphor. How can we play jazz together? Because it's not an orchestra, you know? We don't all have to. It's kind of like figuring out the notes as we go and trying to find an imperfect rhythm, you know. And I think once we take the charge out of it, once we bring in a bit of sense of play and not the fear of getting it wrong, because we are going to get it wrong. You could read all the books in the world, you know, keep yourself informed. You know, there is no script for this work. And I think what I've seen a lot when I do consult is a lot of people like, tell me how to be. Like, give me a script. What do I say, don't say? And what do I do, don't do? I'm like, no such thing exists. You just need to learn to relate to people, you know, to just talk to them, you know, understand the experience. And there's a Rumi quote that I love, that beyond right and wrong is a field, meet me there. It's like, let's meet in that space. And I think a lot of how the personal interacts with a community or society is, you know, I work around the concepts of, it's Otto Sharma theory U, where he talks about open mind, open heart, and open will. And I think for me, it's always about doing a check as to how open your mind is. You know, how much of the past determines how you engage in the present, you know, how open your heart is, you know, are you cultivating compassion and love? And I think with an open mind and open heart, you're able to then lean into a future, able to then act from that emerging place. And I think for me, that's a much more generative place to act. And I think that it's, you know, it's always about, again, in the crossing of the bridge, realizing that you can't do it alone, and you can't do it with a sense of creativity. You know, where I come from, like the institutions that I work for are based on a site called Constitution Hill. And what we've learned from there is that you need a bit of art, you know, you need a bit of creativity, and most importantly, you also need a sense of memory. I don't think you could do this work, I don't think you can be in relationship with others if you don't have an appreciation, recognition, acceptance of history. So memory becomes very important, because if you're trying to cross this bridge with no memory, you'll find yourself going backwards and not realizing it. You'll find yourself not making any progress at all. So those are just some of the thoughts that I have. And also for me, I've realized that things clicked for me. You know, I can be a constitutional lawyer. That doesn't mean I have an open heart or open mind. I realized that I became an effective lawyer once I had a deeply transformative experience. If you haven't had a deeply personal transformative experience, there's no policy in the world, there's no law in the world that will incentivize you to connect with others. And that experience for me particularly came when I visited a prison. I realized in all the ways my mind and my heart were closed and how I was stuck on the bridge. And it really changed how I approached my work, because that moment required me to deeply transform before I could interact with some of these issues that were coming up in my work in a very humane way.
I don't know if there's anything either of you would like to add. Otherwise, I guess the one thing I'm interested in the dance is the range of emotions, as you say, in this delicate framing and the navigational work. There is a hesitancy because there's a lot of emotional stuff that comes with this, both emotional when you are on. You know, I'm a white woman, so when I'm intentionally or unintentionally doing things that reinforce stereotypes or reinforce structures of power, being confronted with that is naturally very hard. And in the same time, the experience of me doing something that is a microaggression of some kind or an aggression of some kind is deeply painful. So how do we come to the play through those more painful emotions? What do we do with the pain and the anger and the shame even, in order to be free enough to dance? Cindy?
I think one of the things we ought to remember, you spoke earlier on about structure, is that sometimes a quote saying, I haven't, being a strategist myself in a business space, I haven't come across a better strategy than apartheid. It was well structured. When I peel it, it was well thought through. It was an ecosystem thinking. It was a humanity thinking. I'm not taking sides, which side of humanity. It really was beautifully crafted as a strategy, albeit a ill strategy. So what happened there is that we then forgot who we are as a people, as individuals, in matching the structure and an individual. We forgot who we are, and it's interesting how painful it is now to come to self, to come to who you are and accepting that you are a human being. Therefore, in this dance, you need to bring yourself, you need to bring your vulnerability, you need to bring your humility. That's being human. That's feeling pain is being human. And that's part of the dance. And I haven't seen progressive outcomes where that is not brought in, where there is no emotion and a level of pain and a level of embarrassment and shame. I haven't seen progressive outcomes where there's no level of vulnerability. So we need to bring ourselves as human beings, and we have mastered not being human beings. We need to rehumanize people. There was a lot of dehumanization in that strategy I was talking about. And that's part of the dance, and it doesn't make it a easy dance.
Yeah, thank you. So maybe let me start off also with structure. Maybe it's a good place to start. So maybe then to say that sometimes I think we do forget that these structures don't create themselves. We create the structures. That's the first thing. And then I think what we then do is we over-identify with the structures. So race is a structure, construct, and various other things that we live in and through, and we over-identify with those things. And I think that's where the problems begin, right? Because as a metaphor, not literally, this is a space, it's a structure, but it is what we do inside that determines what its function is. And the space and the spirit and the intentions and the relationships in it. So for me, what this means in part is that, yes, there are structures, but structures do not exist independent. In fact, what makes them structures are the people inside them and the relationships that we have in those structures. That's what makes up a structure. Whether you're talking about apartheid, it lasted for as long as it did because, yes, it was a structure, it was well planned, it was layered, it went on, but there were people who were doing, a collective of people who were doing particular actions that maintained the integrity of apartheid, right? So people were voting for the government and so on, there were police, these are people doing these things, right? So at some point, yes, there are structures, but I think at some level, there is no getting away from personal responsibility at some level, okay? So for me, I guess in the work that I do is also to get people to get over the over-identification of a thing that has happened or that has been, so that then the field can be identified, the imagination can be sparked to imagine how things could be different. Because if I'm over-identified with whatever has been and I can't change it, then I'm stuck in a sense, right? There isn't much that I can, then I give up my power, I give up my agency, I give up all the things that are here now in this moment with me because I'm caught up in the past. Now, this is not to say the past or the structure does not matter. I think it matters insofar as it gives me lessons that I can learn things that I can say that was wrong, whether it's personal, relational, or nationwide. Okay, and so I think then to get back to that, to where we got stuck, and I think why we're even still having these conversations, is to go back to the fact that the one of the important places where the structures live and breed is not so much in the physical environment, yes, but it's also in our minds. So insofar as the structures persist in our minds, we're doomed in many ways, right? There isn't much that we can do. So the imagination that you're talking about happens in the mind, right? And so what I think we have not done is to imagine, how do we become a rainbow nation? I think we mistook the vision of the rainbow nation as something that we are rather than as something that we could become. And I think it's that work of becoming and reimagining and having the courage to not overly identify with the structures of race. One last thing I'm going to make on this is that for personally, I find it much more exciting and I feel more alive when I engage with people as they present themselves rather than as prejudging them, oh, you're white, you're Indian, you're this, you're that, because now I'm dealing with the structure, not the person who happens by accident of birth to have been placed in that structure. So again, for me that works. It might not work for someone else, but I find that when I do find myself caught up in my prejudices, I block so much of the person's humanity that you are talking about, because now I'm dealing with the caricature of what I think they are. And then I miss the entire human being altogether.
Rhonda, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was going to say, both of you, I mean, what you said, so much has emerged for me. In talking about apartheid as a structure, you know, I did a lot of work with Albie Sachs, and one of the things that he says quite a lot, that the good thing that came out of apartheid is anti-apartheid. And that solidarity and that articulation of a different vision, and you know, the redemption of so many of the values and the principles that were subverted by apartheid, and having that global solidarity and creating that vision. I think that's important in us reminding ourselves that we're able to build counter structures to things, because we did do that. And the other thing that comes up, you know, talking about overly identifying, I have an Instagram page that I post a lot on, and yesterday I posted, I see someone nodding. So yesterday I posted a thought by Dr. Gabo Mate, which I think you've just articulated, and I just wanted to just say something about that, because he talks about overly identifying. He said a lot of us don't want to be disillusioned, but perhaps we need to be disillusioned, you know, because you don't want to hold an illusion about the world that we're in. And he says that when you overly identify, you know, because you hold this illusion, is that when people criticize something that is a part of that identity, you think, he was making an example with Israel, that if Israel is identified, people think it's a personal attack on them. And there's so many instances of that where you talk about apartheid and a white person will feel personally attacked as if you're talking about them. So there is a distance that's needed. And, you know, as a constitutional lawyer, I deal a lot, in my matters, I used to deal a lot with balance. Because identity is necessary, you know, the language that you speak, you know, everything that makes you up as a human being is so important. And all these rights that we are endowed with and that are entrenched in the Constitution, they're also important, but they require the balance of a right and a responsibility. They require some kind of a dance as well, and it's not science. If it was science, we wouldn't need a constitutional court. Some of these things of how far you go, what is too much, and what you need to give up, and what is due to you, all of that back and forth is something that is almost always a case-by-case basis. It's very hard to just have an outright formula, and that's why I was talking of a dance, because it's not even a choreographed one. It's kind of like the music changes. How flexible are you? Can you slow up, speed down? You know, so as we were talking, those are some of the things that came up, that it requires that human intelligence of knowing how to deal with balancing all of that.
I'm really struck by sort of that analogy of a white person experiencing a conversation about apartheid and having to say it's not personal, but at the same time, don't white people need to build more empathy, to connect more humanly to the reality of what was done in our name and what the lasting legacy is?
I'll say this, a lot of what I've learned comes from how we've built our constitutional court. I tell this story a lot because there's so many gems in that story. The court, like this building, is on a heritage site that has, a very dark history. It was a prison, it was a military fort, known for the worst human rights abuses, and then it was, ultimately chosen to be transformed into the home of the pinnacle of justice, the Constitutional Court. And I think that one of the lessons there is that when that site was chosen as the home of the court, there was no space to build it because it was a sprawling prison complex. It became very clear that they were going to have to demolish parts of this prison, which is a very important part of our history. Since we are at a foundation of a Nobel Peace Prize winner, this prison is the only prison in the world to ever have incarcerated 2 Nobel Peace Prize winners. If you know them, good for you. So it became very clear that we're going to have to demolish parts of this prison, and they consulted with the former prisoners about, we want to transform this place. This is how we want to do it. How would you feel if we demolish parts of it? Some of the prisoners said, we don't care about it, take it down. Others said, there's not enough tangible history, keep it. So the compromise was they didn't demolish everything. They tried to preserve as much as they could, but the parts that were demolished, those bricks were taken, and the court was built with it. So when you walk into the Constitutional Court and see red bricks, those bricks are bricks from the demolished parts of the prison. By sharing the story, what I'm saying to you is that decision was made. Through my interpretation, I say that history will always matter. As a white person, you'll just always have to deal with this lineage, this heritage. It's there. It will always be there. You have to accept it. It happened. But I think with those bricks are saying, don't let it immobilize you. Just as Cameron says, my privilege as a white person, I don't feel shame for it. It gives me energy. It energizes me to do things. So part of using those bricks of history to build something so beautiful, meant to address so much of what happened in the past, is that in the face of that, you're not stuck in the shame. You're not immobilized by this history. It's not weighing so heavily on you that you can't move across the bridge. It can actually energize you. Build something. Be creative. Create something beautiful. Transform those feelings of shame and guilt, because they are not of use,
I want to
Okay.
respond, but I'm aware that you haven't said so. I'm happy for you. Okay, all right. Thank you. Okay. Should white people do more work to do what again?
In general, should
In
white
general.
people do more work?
No, I don't think they should do more work than other people. I really don't think so. Let me explain. So, for example, I don't want to carry the shame and guilt and burden of what the post-apartheid government is not doing right. I don't. I really don't. I really don't want to carry that just because this is a black government. The question whether I vote or not I vote for them, that's a separate question. But I don't want to live with that because they are charged with making the decisions that ought to be beneficial to all of us. So I don't see how it should be my personal burden to carry if they don't do that. That's just how I think about it. So from jumping from that to whether white people should carry the shame and guilt of all things that have been done in the name of white people in this country, I'm not sure. Acknowledging history and acknowledging that these things were done in my name is a different thing. And then saying, I as a person decide that I want to be a different person for myself first, not because of the history. Because I think this is the problem that I think anyone would run up against is now it becomes performative. Now it is outside of me. Now I'm doing it because I'm carrying the guilt and the shame. Yes, you may have benefited and so on and so forth. Just, again, there are many people who benefit from the shenanigans of the ANC today. Just to put it out there. Now, should those people's families who benefit from the shenanigans, who some of them may not even be old enough to know what their parents are doing and siphoning people, should those people carry those burdens for the rest of their lives? I'm not sure. I'm not sure that it's their personal responsibility. I don't think so. We can disagree on this. I think it's the people who made the decision, the adults, the people who made, in this particular case, who should carry the burden of that. The people who benefit will realize, okay, I benefited from this. Whether aware of it, whether I'm aware of it or not, of when it was put together, I benefited from this. Now the question becomes, right, I can't do much to undo, I can't go back and undo that entire history, but how do I decide to live moving forward? And I think that's the main thing. How do I decide to live with myself, first of all, and then consequently in relationship to others? Because if you squeeze an orange, you expect orange juice. Am I right? So if I'm not dealing with my stuff, my own healing, my own guilt, my own shame, squeeze me enough and then see what comes out. Is all of that stuff. The shame, the guilt, and now that sets me up to perform the thing that I want other people to see me as, and sooner or later I get tired of it, and the other people in the room read, this energy is funky, this person is performing, this person is not being real, and then they still reject you. So there's no one wins out of a performance, but if I do the complex work of healing myself and my stuff and the stuff that I can heal to the extent that I can heal it, and then I show up authentically, I think I have a better chance of just living a much happier life. There are things that are beyond my control, such as the way I look and whatever else. That's other people's business. If you're not going to give me an opportunity to interact with you so that you get a sense of who I am, there's nothing I can do about that. Not my circus, not my monkeys.
There's burning questions in the audience. Let's just go to Zinzi quickly, and then we'll try and get a microphone into the audience.
I'll be very short. I think burden, shame, guilt, and I've learned and I've watched how it cripples us. But is there a crippling unconscious and conscious bias sometimes around our identities? Definitely. Do I think there's work to be done? And I mean, to reference Wilhelm, is there white work to be done? Is there black work to be done? Definitely. I agree about, crippling yourself with guilt and shame. And in fact, I don't play that game. I quickly move the person over to the next part. What are you going to do with your privilege? The legacy of privilege that you have and continue to have, your conscious and unconscious bias that you continue to play out, and bring in other structures. I'm in corporate. There are structures in corporate that are informed by that conscious and unconscious bias, and they continue to put people in a place of disadvantage. There is a lot of work that we need to do as a person, and I think we'll have a better dance if white people are conscious and acknowledge about the work that they need to do.
Let me check with the audience. Is there still a burning comment? Maybe you could just give your name before you speak. Thank you.
Okay. So, can you guys hear me? Yes. My name is Ziphelele. I think I just have something to state before I ask the questions that I have. I think burden, guilt, and shame are very normal responses to very normal responses that to our history and our current reality. They are very normal responses, and they are not for black people to figure out and deal with. I think we're now coddling white people. They're supposed to do the work. We're doing the work. We never stop doing the work. It's our reality. We don't choose to do the work. I don't want to be political, but my entire reality is political. So I don't think it's fair that we can say that they're being burdened with shame. We're burdened right now with shame and guilt, and shame mostly, if that makes sense. And the structure is still very much apartheid, like systemically. You see how Cape Town is built, you see the working. I've always known myself to be uZiphelele, who is umXhosa, until I came into the workspace and I became a student. That's when I learned that I'm a black woman. And the further up I go and as I grow, I keep being reminded that I'm a black woman, even though I'm umXhosa in my identity. Okay, so I have a question. How do we find harmony between over-identification and just basically, I have a word, just don't know what the word is, like erasing people's identities? To me, it's important that I identify as black. I'm here right now having this conversation. That means people have lived. I honor my ancestors. You can't take away that identification from me. I honor being a woman, the women who fought so that I'm here right now, in this moment, exactly as I am. And there are many women to come, looking at me. My existence right now is revolutionary. So how do we balance between over-identification and just erasing people? And then I have another question. This is all great. Like, I really love this stuff. Nah. And we're here, we're all academics here, we're all people who are already interested and curious about this work. When does it get out? How does it get out of here? And to the people who are actually quite more problematic, because I can at least acknowledge that you're here, you're attempting to do the work. You're trying to do the work. What of the people sitting at home? What about the managers who continue structures that are abusive? What do we do about that? How do we get this conversation outside of here? How do we facilitate and create spaces that allow for this conversation to happen outside of this jargon of all our education, all our experiences? When do we engage the real people?
So that's very much the next question I was going to ask. Is our aspiration to have a national conversation, how does it leave sort of siloed spaces?
I want to, start with the beginning part of be burdened, be shameful, and have guilt. I don't think there's any emotion that doesn't serve a purpose, including anger. I think where I don't see the usefulness of that, anything that is chronic, you won't produce anything out of that. If you're chronically angry, all the emotions you described, anger, shame, guilt, they could spur you into action. You could get creative with those emotions. They could set you down a path. But if you're chronically burdened, if you're chronically ashamed or chronically angry, you can't tap into anything in that state. It debilitates you, right? So that's how I relate to it. And in my remarks earlier, I was talking about, I don't think if we show up in society with just those emotions, it's enough. That's how I feel about hope. For me, the times of hope is useless. I'm often brought into rooms to give people hope. I don't think you need hope to get on the path. Just do the work, and the outcome of the work will give you the hope. You'll give yourself, a proof of concept. So that's the point I was making, that to be chronically guilty or chronically ashamed, I don't see the productivity out of that. When it comes to a national conversation, when it comes to how this work gets out, the other thing I know is, I'm not interested in beating people over the head, with this work. What I do is mostly for myself. What I said earlier is that we often look to the manager to transform. We look to the company to transform, and they have to. and you have to demand that, right? And I think there needs to be consequences, especially for people in power who are custodians of resources and who are responsible for the welfare of so many citizens and so many people, that you can only be in that position if you hold certain qualities. If you don't, you shouldn't be in that position. And I think that's the activist work that needs to be done in that particular company and all of that. But the one thing I'll tell you, that when it comes to law, for instance, when it comes to the limits, I've found limits in the tool that I've chosen. When it comes to law, I realized that there's so many gains that could be made through law. I've seen so many people's lives change through legal advances. But also in my practice, I hit a wall. There were certain things that I had to admit to myself, that what I've chosen as a tool, has its limits. The law can't make any of you in this room love each other. It can't make your manager love you. No policy in your company is going to make your manager love you, trust you. It can't engender human, affection. That's the function of something else. And that's something else I'm trying to figure it now, is what is that thing? But at the same time, a lot of it is an internal, it's an internal process. And I'm trying to pick up other tools outside of law to see how else, change happens. And the other thing I'll say about overly identifying is that my book is it's called Made in South Africa, a black woman's stories of, so there's a lot of identification there. And I think if I understand what we said earlier, it's not about not identifying. It's never about erasing people's identities, but overly identifying is a problem. Right? It can lead to a lot of uncritical thinking and blindness, because there are moments when I'm in my circle of black women friends and we have the sense that we are so ennobled, that we're so virtuous, that we are beyond critique and we are beyond, any of, the work that needs to be done. If you overly identify, I think it's good to identify. It's the same with, it's the balance that you need to do with legal rights, as I was saying earlier on. That in as much as you're entitled to freedom, in as much as you're entitled to so many of the rights that are enumerated in the Constitution, at some point they're limited. At some point you hit up against another person and you need to balance your being with that other person's conception of their freedom. So for me, I don't have a clear answer for you, because it's a dance you have to figure out. You will know for yourself when, overly identifying poses a problem. And I think we should be invested in the issues of overly identifying, because we're seeing the issues that it's causing in the Middle East. Take it outside of yourself. Overly identifying, when you see it in other people, you see its dangers, and because we're human beings, don't think you're beyond that.
Thank you, Lwando. I guess I'm conscious of the sort of the workplace as a site in which we encounter difference and in which we are encountered, but in which there's also lots and lots of power hierarchies and an enormous potential to liberate or to do damage. And I wonder, Zinzi, maybe if you could give us a little reflection on, you've got sort of a bird's eye view of a massive workplace that comes in many different forms. How does this work land in a site where there are these power structures in place, where we are walking out so much of this history in unconscious ways as well as structural ways?
I think where we started talking structures and individuals, I think Buhle did allude to it, that structures are made of people, organizations are made of people, workplace is made of people. So you quickly realize that the work that you ought to do is individual work, at the end of the day. A leader that transforms a company is an individual with context, with identity, with everything that makes up that leader's perspective, to everything. We interact in workplace with individuals. The construct of workplace itself comes with a lot of legacy, structural legacy. The construct of capitalism comes with exploitation of labor to get gains. Therefore, it takes a lot of work for leaders in the workplace to make the shift. It takes creating a lot of tools. When I introduced myself, I spoke to the fact that I was asked to start a BE office. It was merely a compliance thing. We have to comply with this thing. We JSE listed. Let's get it done. Becomes a tick box exercise. If you do give it to somebody who doesn't have the consciousness of looking at it from an intent point of view, it becomes exactly that, a tick box exercise, damage a lot of people in the process, create hopes that are fake, literally, with suppliers coming in, small black suppliers coming in and out, and not growing and not become sustainable. So there are all these tools and opportunities. Employment equity is the same. I sit on the Commission for Employment Equity. And right now we at a point where we have put out sectorial targets, because the pace of transformation in the country is evidently so slow that there's just no hope. So the workplace does present, if I speak about my workplace, we have just in South Africa over 30,000 people. Imagine the influence and the impact that workplace can have on lives of many people, from how people are remunerated, the benefits. We launched, as part of our inclusive justice, a program where we're looking at just wage. We reflected as a leadership to say minimum wage is not a living wage, and a living wage is not a just wage. Then we had to reflect for ourselves, what does a just wage mean? If we commit to inclusive justice, therefore social justice as a business, what does that mean? So the opportunity that sits in workplace, the opportunity that sits in the construct of business and capitalism, the influence in supply chains that we can make as business, for me, is huge, huge, huge. Hence, I am so on a trip to say there's a case for this country's imagined future to focus on social justice in business, or rather business-led social justice, which is one of the focuses that we have in the Restitution Foundation. What is the role of business in social justice? What is the role of youth in social justice? And how do those converge for this hope and this reimagination of a life we can have together as a collective? Thanks,
Lindsay. I'm struck with the question of how this breaks out. And it reminded me of a conversation I had with Dr. Mampela Rampele at one point, where I was trying to get to grips with how did Black consciousness take root so powerfully. And what she said to me was that it was because they set up clinics in which they solved people's practical needs, but treated them with utmost dignity. And that experience of being treated with dignity was the root from which the rest of the Black consciousness sort of movement could spring. And it's so interesting to think about where are the sites we have in our own lives and in our spheres of influence, our businesses, our organizations, our families, where we can do the consciousness raising work by fundamentally changing the way we treat each other in some way. I see there's lots of hands, so I've got 1, 2, 3. Who is doing the... Okay, let's start. Yeah, we'll start there in the middle. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. My name is Moadia. I just want to say, okay, when you speak about identity, right, okay, I identify as colored. And in the colored identity, there's so much to unpack, right? When it comes to shame, when it comes to what does it mean to be colored, you know? And when we reflect on that, we also have to take in consideration the apartheid system, because it was all about divide and conquer. Because colored people are also black. But unfortunately for me, I can only identify as black politically, but culturally I have to identify as colored, right? And when we delve into those issues of identity and over-identifying, I must disagree, because I don't think we can say that we are over-identifying, because these things determine our reality, right? Because, for example, speaking about white people and their shame, you know, and coddling the idea of should they have shame or not, but the reality is that as much as we are suffering the injustices of apartheid, likewise, white people are enjoying the benefits thereof. They are enjoying the generational wealth of apartheid, while we have to face these consequences. So, me as an academic, I did all my studies at Stellenbosch University. That was a very difficult experience for me, because we find people driving cars that my parents would never be able to afford, can never imagine driving, right? So how can we ignore those realities? How can we not take into consideration the impact that the history has had on our current reality? You know, we're not saying that white people must now be like, oh, you know, apologetic all the time, but they need to take into consideration what the impact of our history has currently on our circumstances. And we are not against being in harmony with them, but what is the way forward? Because we cannot ignore our history, because history determines what is happening currently, and it will predetermine what the future will look like, right?
I think we're saying the same thing. You know, I actually think we're saying the same thing, and at the risk of us, you know, misunderstanding each other, there's nothing you've said that lets me believe that you overly identify with being colored. Mm-hmm. There's nothing. Neither of you have said anything that makes me believe that. I'm talking about people. Have you ever seen an American patriot? Have you ever experienced one?
No, I have not.
No, I'm making an example. I'm making an example of an experience that I've had with someone who overly identifies to the point where they are blind to the rest of the world.
But we are not blind. The thing is, we do the work. Let's say, for example, me, I'm not going to speak for anyone else. I'm going to speak about my personal experience. I've done the work. I'm still doing the work. But yet, when people look at me, they don't look at me, as this person who's doing the work. No, I'm still seen as a colored person. When every corner I turn, I'm going to be racially profiled.
Can I ask you a question? What did you hear me say? I'll tell you why. If you could repeat back to me what I've said.
You're speaking about an American experience of a patriot. So I'm just trying to tell you about my experience as a South African. Yes, South Africa and USA, they mimic similar identities, similar histories. They had the Jim Crow laws and colonization in America. Similar, we had colonization and apartheid in South Africa. But we are still suffering from those injustices. And no matter how much I do the work, it doesn't change the fact that if my brother walks around down the street, there's going to be racial profiling. So many times at Stellenbosch University, people that were students, people of color, walking to the streets, campus security stops them and tell them, oh, are you a student here? But for white people, they don't have the same experience. So how do we navigate those issues? That's what I want to know, because we can't ignore everything that happened. Yeah. We have to take it into account to move forward. We need to address those injustices, because at the end of the day, apartheid was a psychological strategy. The person that created apartheid was coming from Stellenbosch University in the psychology department. Wilcox was the teacher of Verwoerd, the apartheid architect. So how do we navigate those issues?
And can the conversation not become about about white people's guilt?
Okay.
Because we have our own guilt and own shame
because
that we have to deal with.
Okay, we're getting lots of interest. Let's take the three hands that were up, and then we'll come back to reflections from the panel.
Hi, my name is Lauren. I wasn't here since the beginning of the conversation, but I'd just like to comment on what I heard. In the context of let them sit with their privilege and figure their privilege out for themselves in the same conversation as identification and not over-identifying. Those were two national projects that were created. Privilege, white privilege, was constituted and facilitated and in fact embedded with the apartheid and colonial system. It thrives because we still live through a colonial gaze. We still live through apartheid laws. That's why it thrives. In the same context that identification and warning us to not over-identify, those are very crippling conversations to have in the context of a South African space. I'm from a township, and the fact that I'm from a township and I was born in 1994, and the same people that were poor during apartheid are still poor. My mother's a domestic worker, and she's been a domestic worker my entire life. Me being the first person in my family to go to university is not supposed to be the way that it is. And then you want to tell me that privilege that has benefited someone their entire life generationally does not benefit them into a continuum? I think it's very crippling to have those conversations and to say those things in silos. And again, I would like to echo what Uzphelele said. How can we have these conversations? I'm an academic myself, but I always criticize academia because we have these conversations, we perpetuate them in these rooms with people that already have this intellect. And if we are having these conversations, these crippling conversations at these spaces, imagine what is not being trickled down, right? The same way we go into spaces and into environments, to rural spaces, into township spaces, we have those subjectivities already embedded in our minds because we are facilitating these crippling conversations. I think we need to check our privilege in ourselves as well. And then before we say privilege needs to be checked by the person, allow that person to, I think that's very damaging and crippling. Privilege, white privilege, is part of the national apartheid project. Identification, black women were considered perpetual minors during the apartheid system, and that has not continued. And I know you mentioned something of black women need to sort of, I can't direct quote, check ourselves and not see ourselves outside of doing the work. How much damage has not been done to us, and you are still asking us to do the work? I think that is extremely damaging. I really think that that's damaging.
Thank you. We're going to take the final hand and then come back to thoughts from the panel.
Hi everyone, my name is Sandile Chavalala, and I'm a co-founder of a business called Huruma Banvu. Huruma means compassion in Swahili, and Banvu means people in Siswati. So we do a lot of work in social impact, and I'm also an African philanthropy scholar. I think my question is to do a bit differently on the conversation, but really narrowing down on the intent of today. And I think I just want to applaud Woolworths for really choosing to partner with the foundation, and that shows corporate responsibility, but also shows corporate citizenry, that as a corporate you are a citizen and you're active in that citizenry. And I think my question is to all three of you, if you can just answer me from your constitutional perspective, Lwando, Dr. Zuma, if you can answer from your spiritual and social psychology perspective, and then Zinzi, if you can also just answer from your perspective as a corporate affairs director. My question is, how are we reimagining companies and corporates as active citizens going forward, but more so, how do we see healing taking place in the corporate spaces, not just in the workspace? Because as you spoke about individuals and how leaders make decisions, they've got their own context, backgrounds, and all of those biases. But how is South Africa creating the next generation of corporate leaders? And how does that look like in those perspectives that you have? I mean, from a constitutional point of view, what is the role of corporates in promoting, transformative constitutionalism? From a spiritual and social context, how are corporates coming closer to townships, coming closer to rural communities, and really making a difference in improving people's lives? And of course, from your side as well, how are the boards of directors having conversations about communities and reimagining in South Africa? Because I think too much blame is given to government, but often corporates facilitate a lot of the stuff that government do wrong, and as well to say that companies whip behind apartheid, and companies did make apartheid what it was, and post apartheid, post Zuma, post Mandela, post Thabo Mbeki, post Cyril, corporates will continue to take what they can to leave everyone else without anything.
Thank you, everyone. Some really powerful reflections there. I mean, the combination of this question about the lived reality of marginalization that continues, with then this question of the individual work when you're living in a society that has dimensions of marginalization. And I'm interested in as thinking about marginalization also beyond race, which is maybe something that as South Africans we're not very good at. And then, yeah, really, what is it that we can do differently to reshape and reimagine how the structures of our society, whether they're corporates or government, can operate in a context of trying to reimagine things. Bukla?
Yeah, thank you. So I wanted to, maybe I'm going to respond to that in a way, but I also wanted to pick up on what was being said at the back. So it strikes me that everything you said is true. And what strikes me, though, is that you've had to do the work personally to get yourself out of the orchestrated structures of poverty and lack. And I've had to do the same, and I think a lot of people of color sitting here have had to do the same. I've had to take on the work individually, for the most part, right? To do the work and be committed and be determined to go on and on. Of course, there are always people supporting and so on and so forth, if you're lucky to have that. But the point that I'm trying to make is that, yes, the oppression, the privilege, everything that we so know well of happened at a structural, systematic, we know that. We know that. But it strikes me that to get out of that, it often takes individuals who then lift others out of those. And usually it's brother and sister, and then a family comes out of that, right? That's how at least it has worked out in my life. I'm not sure whether you've experienced the same thing. This happens despite the policies that we talk about being in place, that there should be free education, there should be this, there should be that, in this dispensation that we're in. It happens, the legacies continue despite that. And so the question for me is, why is that? Is because it seems to me that the policy, the practice, whatever it is, gets eaten up for breakfast by the culture, or rather by what we do every day. Because if we don't embody the policy, if we don't embody the constitution, if that does not become part of what we do and how we think and how we relate, it's just a policy. Eaten up every day for breakfast in a family, in a job place, whatever it may be, in a relationship, whatever the intentions are, if we don't embody that, it never happens. So it comes back again to us. What are we doing? For me, the question is, how are we embodying the things that we're espousing? How are we living them every day? How are we using those things to reimagine how our fundamental relationships with self and then with others look like differently? Because if we don't do that, it seems to me that 20 years we'll still be bemoaning the histories and legacies of apartheid, because we are not embodying the very things that we want us to become. As I said, the problem is not that there's a rainbow nation, is that we're not doing the work to become that rainbow nation. And well, that's precisely the point that I also don't know entirely the answer to, but for as far as I can see it, it means, to me at least, that how I show up in relation to you, right? But that relation has to start with me. I have to change how I see myself, so that when I see you as a black woman, I don't see the things that history has made you to be. I see you as a person that I can and open to engage with, so I can encounter the unique person that you are, not what history has told me you are or should be. And I think that's where it starts with me, at least the way I see it. Because if I don't do that work of getting over my own bigotry, my own sexism, my own male privilege and all of that, then when I encounter you, I encounter the very same thing that you are bemoaning, right? And I will join in the struggle. Yes, we're bemoaning this stuff, but I haven't worked it out of my system. So the only thing I can give to you at any time we meet is exactly that same thing, no matter how much I'm against it. But because it lives in me, it's the only thing I can give. So the intention is good, but am I embodying that? Is it what I'm practicing every day? Is it something that I'm trying to, for me as a black male, right? I have to do that as a black person. I'm not saying black men don't have, we have our own privilege. We have to do that work. And so then it goes across the board, I think, with everything else. If we accept that as the foundation, or if we accept that premise, then it must apply to everything else and to everyone else. No, I didn't say that, madam.
Let's
Can I quickly respond to that?
so Bukhle, I'm going to let you quickly respond, but then Luando Zinzi, if there's
So, okay.
I don't agree. Like, you cannot individualize this work. There's no I person, there's no me, you, personal work, what you have to do. I admire the work that you've done. We're also doing a lot of work. A lot of people are doing, wait. We're all doing work. There are people that, you said something like, despite the policies that exist, yet here she is with her struggles. She made it. She's an anomaly. She's not normal. How many other people in the community she comes from are where she is, are able to say the things that she says, and you're still giving her the burden of spreading this information and saying, oh, let me empower everyone. It's problematic.
I'm going to let, I don't want to get into
Let
a
me respond
debate,
to that very
so I'm
quickly.
going to let
It doesn't have to be
Bukhle
a
respond,
debate.
and
Okay.
then...
So it's interesting to me that there's a switch, right? There's a switch. So on the one hand, you're happy to say, I've done the work, right? But then in the same breath, it's not personal. It's not individual. So then who has done the work if not you? Oh, no, I'm talking about the statement that says, I have done the work. I have done the work. It was the statement, right? And I'm saying but that's precisely the point, that we have to do the work. I'm not saying that the responsibility is entirely on people who have been formerly oppressed and who continue to suffer from the legacy of apartheid, but to the extent that we are still here, there is something for us to do. Whether you see that as it's your work, it's not your work, that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying it is your responsibility to go preach the gospel, but I'm saying to the extent that you want your life to change, you have to do some level of the work, period.
So, yes, Cindy, go ahead. You want to jump?
Maybe at this point, try a little bit to answer a question that will probably, sorry I didn't get your name in front, probably take me a whole night to answer, because it is a systemic issue. You don't solve systemic issues with, a bullet or one solution. So it's a systemic solution that we got to get to. But I want to, at this point, to own the fact that I am a product of affirmative action. I am in this position because somebody made a decision to include me. Oh wait, not to include me, but to count me in a corporate, to give me access into a corporate. And then I didn't work to get there. Maybe, I don't want to go to how I even got my degree, but somebody made that decision that we're going to have a graduate recruitment program. It's going to focus on black people. And I'm a product of affirmative action. And somebody else comes into a corporate and they are a product of employment equity these days, and they don't do the work. They don't know how to do the work. They choose not to do the work. I came in and I did the work. So it's the doing work in corporate, I still think it's a personal choice. And I speak to people in the company, and we have a deep conversation, and I acknowledge the fact that they choose not to do the work, and it's okay. The company must do the work that it needs to do. The system in the company must do that work. So in answering you, Budi, in terms of, how can we, it's all sorts of tools, it's consciousness. What it took for us, I gave a bit of context in terms of, it was just compliance, and then we shifted it from compliance to say, what are we trying to do? Businesses don't do compliance, they do strategies. Then we said, oh, okay, we're trying to do transformation. What is transformation? When you use big words, what is that? Like, what is transformation? And one of the things that pivoted us so beautifully is actually COVID. Because COVID, I mean, there was a cliche during COVID about how it exposed, you know, the social ills in our country. It really brought humility in our business. That we got as a leadership to a point where our CEO stood up, something that has never happened, and acknowledged our company as a microcosm of South Africa. Therefore, within the company, there is marginalization, inequality, and discrimination, and that we're choosing to do something about it. What was amazing when that commitment was made, the people who signed up. So to your point around individual work, people sometimes need to be given context to do the individual work. It's difficult to do individual work. I've fought in corporate on my own, and I've seen people who fight in corporate and they never make it. The system is a way of kicking you out. But when you have a CEO that's gonna come up and say, we acknowledge there's marginalization, we want to do this work, that gives a platform for more people. There's still people who do not want to do the work. Then it's the role of corporate to cultivate and bring out tools and bring out platforms. We've got a thing that we call voice platforms, where we're saying any voice is acknowledged to be heard. I mean, is given an opportunity to be heard, listening, you know. So here's a platform, whether you identify as a black person, as a woman, as a person from the community, from the LGBTQIA plus community, here's a platform. Until you do those things, that work just doesn't happen. Even with that, not everybody belongs to those platforms. You know, but it's I always say, where are the hooks? We do put out targets, you know, for certain things, and for some people they're gonna do it because it's part of their target. Then what the responsibility is for the company is to make sure that how they do it. Because remember, you can give access to people and you achieve numbers, but until you include them in your practices, in your policies, in the way of being on a daily basis, they're not gonna, you know, we've experienced as a corporate a revolving door syndrome where people come in the same numbers as we lose them because they don't feel included. And we have to reflect about that, but we've given them access, but they're not staying. What's the problem? It's our culture. It's our policies. It's our day-to-day. It's unconscious and conscious bias in the line managers. And people sometimes don't leave a company, they leave a line manager, they leave a person, because they cannot bear, you know, the injustice that they experience, the undertone. Because that's another thing in a corporate environment is that, you know, we're very polite. We're very polite. You're not gonna hear like dramatic things. It's very subtle, very polite. It can be easily embedded in a performance management system or in a remuneration system. You work at the consciousness and the psyche of the corporate and therefore of the individuals to make sure that the right decisions, better decisions, inclusive decisions are being made. You make commitments, you do. So in trying to balance, I think the conversation we're having now is that some of us choose to do the work. Some of us get called to do the work. Some of us choose to do the work. Some of us want to do the work, but we don't know how. Some of us choose not to do the work, you know. Some of us are really just can't. We find, I mean, I work with communities, part of my portfolio, I work with communities. And, you know, even when we say, you know what, we want to help, can you share with us what you've been doing in the community, trying to be inclusive? What do you think is the solution to the challenges we have? The rank that we come with as a corporate, the rank and power really cripples people. And then you get to work hard and hard to invite people at the table and feel like you are a partner. You can't say I'm your partner. You got to demonstrate that you want to be a partner. So it's a lot of work. And we are varying, we are diverse. I mean, if we're talking about diversity, this work requires that we acknowledge that we are diverse even in terms of, our I don't want to call it willingness to do the work, but whether we can do the work or not. And I'm okay if people don't want to do the work. But we need to do the work that makes sure that they leave those people in a better position. We need to do the structural work that leaves them in a better position. They really don't have to do the work. But I've said it before, you asked the question, and I'd love to hear your voice in this. There is white work to be done in South Africa. There's not enough white work. There's work. I chair the Restitution Foundation. We're very clear about in the foundation that there's still a lot of finding each other, forgiving, true sorriness. We haven't done true sorriness in this country. We jumped into reconciling. You don't reconcile with someone if you don't acknowledge what has been done. And we're now starting to see people who do proper restitution. What do I mean by that? White kids who say, I don't want to inherit this. I don't want this inheritance. We've done work with families, around restitution that say, I know enough about the history of my family that I don't want to inherit this. Can this be used differently? So if this is painful, restitution is even more difficult, but it's a journey to get there. And I feel like we've shortchanged the journey.
Yeah, that's a helpful reflection, Zinzi. I mean, I'm a big proponent of white work, but I think the struggle we're having even tonight is that on the one hand, structural intervention without consciousness raising gets us nowhere, and that's some of the compliance stuff that you're talking about. But consciousness raising without any structural change means that we're stuck. I'm so conscious that the TRC was at once a process of victims and perpetrators telling their stories, but the recommendations that came out of it were also about the nature of society that we wanted to have. And one of them was that there should be a wealth tax on white people. I didn't explicitly say white people, but the Arch later said a wealth tax on white people. And I think that sort of radical proposition to say, what could we do that structurally would change this so that there is a fertile soil in which all the consciousness work can grow a new imagined place? I think that's the struggle, is the reality of marginalization, economic, racial, gender, sexual orientation, and the reality of how that is experienced every day with the reality of the structures of society. I mean, if I speak as a queer woman, I have had to do an enormous amount of work to not be homophobic to myself, to have peace with who I am. And I've found it very interesting that I have had many communities in which I can live in a beautiful queer system, which I don't have to deal with heterosexism. But I come up against it. I have a child who goes to a school, and every form has a mother and a father. Every form. Luckily, Home Affairs has Parent 1 and Parent 2. Well done, South Africa. But there are these ways in which the structures of society always speak back to us about the things that we are marginalized about. And I think we have to find the way to speak into those structures as much as we do the work to liberate ourselves. Luando,
Yeah.
You're looking pensive.
Yeah, I'm very pensive because I think what tends to happen in conversations like this amplify what's happening at a national level and at a global level. I think some of the things going through my mind is, as a facilitator of conversations where, you try and build a best practice for a good conversation. There have been some lessons there And one of the lessons is, from what place do you listen? And how generous is your listening? And the nature of your questions that you ask, and how, iterative those questions are. And I think a lot of being in conversation is iterative work. I don't only have these conversations in this room. There are high schools, there are township communities in Alex where we do pro bono work and we run, constitutionalism workshops. You have to be deft enough to move in and out of spaces, and also to know where your voice is not the voice. To know where, how you pitch things and how you say things may not be the place for you. That someone else may be better suited for those different spaces, and to know your own limitations and where you are of value and of use and where you're not. And I think one of the things that I want to say is that there are conversations I'm not equipped to have, don't have the capacity to have, and also don't have the interest to have. And where I'm at in my life right now is that I'm part of a fellowship. It's called the Atlantic Fellows for Racial Equity. And it's such an interesting space there to talk about race, to talk about identity, and to give people the space. I mean, Pelele and I are in that same fellowship. We think so differently about race. We really do, but we dance. But the journey that we're on together is, how do we get to even post-nationalism? Because we see how belonging to nations is destroying the world. If you talk about reimagining, where is, our level of creativity? I get the starting point, but if I'm gonna move across this bridge, part of the excitement that makes me want to move across this transformative bridge for myself is, what else is possible? How can we even get to a place of playing with this? We're not at that place right now, but in that fellowship, that's what we look at. There are people who play with race. I have a friend who's biracial. And he says to me, the benefit of being biracial is, one day I can put on this hat, the next I can put on another hat. And initially I thought, oh, you're betraying black people. You can't just ditch me every time you want to wear the other hat. It's a right that he's earned to do. And he's been able to find some benefit in playing around with race in that way. And so for me, there is a flexibility that I'm looking towards, and how we even play with what it means to be South African. There are people who think being South African is you have to be born here. There are people who look at certain identities as things that need to be legislated for you to claim them. And for me, I would love to be as expansive as possible. And ultimately, there are moments where I want to transcend into, what would a post-racial world look like? And we're not even there. Right now, race does matter. And in constitutionalism, it is critical. It is legislated in Section 9 of the Constitution that who you are, the culture you belong to, ethnicity, your nationality, all those things matter. But I've heard justices of the court is like, do you think we'll make it to a point where it doesn't? Only if we do the work. And you were talking about what companies need to do. That's an interesting question for me, because if there's one thing that I'm a strong proponent on is reparations. We will never get there if we don't know how to repair. And to be honest, when you look at the numbers of the TRC, if you look at how many people testified, if you look at, what was paid out to people who were considered victims, if you look at how many people were considered victims, it was nominal. It was nominal to a point where if we have any hope of making it across this bridge, it will never work, especially when you look at corporates that were implicated in apartheid who don't see it as part of, their responsibility to pay back what was earned illegally or what was earned at the destruction of black people. Even American companies, there was a trial in the US that was thrown out where American companies were asked to pay back and to repair what they've broken in this country, and they're not going to do it, right? And perhaps where I'd love to end is what I've come to realize for myself. And when I speak for myself, it doesn't have to be anyone else's truth or opinion. It's based on my experience and where I am right now in my thinking. And without it being distorted, because earlier on, the point of overly identifying was not aimed at anyone in this room. It was aimed at something that tends to happen, that can be a hindrance in moving across that bridge. If you're overly identifying if you're not a critical thinker. And no one, I haven't seen anything of that nature here. So I think that was taken out of context, and I think it bears clarifying. But I think where I'd like to end is that a lot of my reflection is on something that's called an unthinkable thought. And the unthinkable thought is, what if we don't get it right? What if your manager never gets it right? What if reparations are not made? What if corruption continues at the level that it's at? What if we don't make it across the bridge? What's the value of your life if those things don't happen? And lastly, one thing I've come to appreciate, that resistance is always necessary, but resistance should be for its own reward, as Ta-Nehisi Coates says. Because if you're resisting because you think the dream will come through in your lifetime, it may never come true in your lifetime. So if you don't get any reward from resisting, if you don't find any kind of beauty or creativity in resisting, if resisting is not enlivening, not because it's getting you a result, but because you get to be true to yourself and your politics and your values.
Thank you, Londo. I am conscious of time, and so maybe we can hear just some last thoughts from Buhle and Zinzi, and then take the conversation to each other.
Okay. I'll be quick.
Yeah.
I'll be quick. I think it's just to tag on what Lwando has said. It goes back to the question of work, right? Exactly where she ended off, right? What if none of this changes? What is the value of your life? And for me, it goes back to the point that we have to do the work. We just have to do the work, because if the system remains as it is or gets worse, I still have to find value, and I still have to live with myself and with the ones that are around me anyway, and as we try to spread it out. But it starts with me. I still have to, because I don't think someone is going to come and give me the dignity that I'm looking for. I have to carve out a space and a way in which I can live with dignity. I hear people saying, you're going to die with dignity. I think we live with dignity. So I have to do the work, whether it's spiritual, social, whatever it is, to create the thing that I do want to see in my own life. If the structures and the powers that be are doing what they're doing and that tallies with what I'm doing, great. But if they don't, I still have to live with myself. And as a family, we still have to live with ourselves. And as a community, and so on and so forth. And so that's why I'm saying we cannot at any point abdicate personal responsibility. It goes back to what Zins was saying, right? You have the policies, but I think what the point you were saying is that then you had to create a culture out of it. If there was no culture, and the culture is what we do, how we think, how we invite, how we do, that's embodying it, the point I was making earlier on. But without that transmutation of the policy into the embodiment, it never quite takes shape. The policy is great, but are we living it? Thank you.
Zinzi?
I'm looking at the topic for today, reimagining who we can be together. It speaks to coexistence. It speaks to acknowledging difference in that coexistence. It speaks to acknowledging perspective and acknowledging what everyone brings to the pot in this reimagination of this future together. And I'm wondering if we all want it. Sometimes I do wonder. But I think there's enough people who do want to reimagine the life, and if I bring it to corporate again, the corporate voice is, I wish corporate South Africa knew the potential of that future in making this country sustainable, in making this economy sustainable, in making, in just us being self-sustaining as a people of South Africa. I don't think corporate South Africa, I'm generalizing, I don't think corporate South Africa realizes that. You know, I'm always fascinated by, I'm going to use my own, my own company. I'm always fascinated that I'll go to shop and there's nothing that is of my make. I'm like, who are you selling for? You're missing the point. But at a level, there's a dignity issue there. There's an inclusion issue there in terms of, so we're starting to talk about that at Woolies to sort of say, do you realize this doesn't reflect inclusion? Just the product offering doesn't. I mean, we talk about the fact that we were quick to jump at making an Italian range, and you know, but no South African range. But I hope now you enjoy Amakwenya Bisto Mngosho. So again, Budwam, it's the authenticity of it that should reflect in everything, in the being of a company, in the being. And I keep imagining if every business in South Africa will start to thinking a little bit different. Wow. If you leave me with that thinking, I'll go to bed smiling.
Well, then we'll leave it there so you can go to bed smiling. I'm very conscious that we haven't had as much engagement as I would have liked to have, but I think it would be really powerful for us to enjoy some food together and to keep talking. I'm feeling very full of emotion, and I think that's testament to the realities of these conversations, is that to be in them genuinely is to be in them humanly, and that there are no easy answers to this. There's no easy switch to magically make out of trauma and structural violence and separation a new togetherness and a new way of being. But hopefully we can start by holding firm to the idea that it is even possible. So thank you to Luando, to Bukhle, to Zinzi for your wisdom and your contribution. We like to bring the arch into the room when we can, and so we have one little video which is a reminder to us of what the arch stood for, that we like to keep coming back to. So we'll close with that, and then let's eat and talk together.
The tidal wave of change is made up of a million ripples. It says, hey, he's done that. Maybe I can. And it builds up, and it builds up, and it builds up. You can change the world. You can change the world. You must not pause now. Do not let them down.
Amen.
and it builds up, and it builds up, and it builds up.
Evangeli ndiyayishumayela njengodudu onendleko unetyala ndizuthula dudu siyayifuna le nguqu asinova ngamadududu sikuyo le ndlela asijiki du
Umuntu. A person is a person through other persons. The essence of being human.
Ithumbi nababantu kuphubuntu abanye sebenikezele bathakhonde ingumuntu Nono sisixhobe sigcwele uthuthu xa sikuthuntu asincedisani noluntu kodwa inyana neyifuntu
A person is a person through other persons.
basa ingculaza abantwana nale ndlala incamathele inkokheli zingozidlele bayahlutha sibukele
Age is not over. Whoever is the perpetrator, as long as I have breath in my body, I will speak up against injustice. Watch out. Watch out. To narrow the gap between the haves and the have-nots. I cannot worship a homophobic God. Wouldn't it be wonderful if
babesithandana ntombi namfana sikhululekile
Wouldn't it be wonderful if
babesikwazi uvana nobulwimi lwethu lohlukile
Wouldn't it be wonderful if
babesiphilisana nendalo kuba lo mhlaba siphiwe siyaya phambili ixesha lethu selifikile
climate change is for real?
Our time is now
It is the younger generation leading the way. Do what you can, where you can. Do not let them down. You must not pause now. Women are excluded just simply and solely because they are women.
ezansi nibuke fike manje Afrika igazi lini ngoba ungayiphika ayizujika nculude okanye ngine siyabulalana kodwa sinukhuselana silizana sinokwakhana khanyisa bawo kumnyama
And it builds up, and it builds up, and it builds up. You can change the world. You can change the world.
sayishumayela njengodudu andizuthula dudu asinova ngamadudududu asijiki du
The tidal wave of change is made up of a million ripples.